Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Teresa Ladrigan-Welpley, and I serve as the director of the Bannon Institutes in the Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education here at Santa Clara. The Bannon Institute was founded in 1982 by 3 generations of the Bannon family to honor their Uncle Lou, Father Louis Bannon of the Society of Jesus, a longtime teacher and counselor at the university. Today's Bannon Memorial Lecture is a signature event, advancing the originating purpose of the Bannon Institute, articulated by Father Lou over 35 years ago. Quote, "To cultivate the university's moral and spiritual, as well as intellectual and aesthetic values. This involves seeking answers for not only what is, but what ought to be," end quote. Today we turn our attention to issues of economic justice and the common good as part of the 2016-2018 Bannon Institute, engaging the question and call, is there a common good in our common home? A summons to solidarity. Economic justice has been a central focus of Catholic social teaching since Pope Leo XIII issued the first major social encyclical of the Church, Rerum Novarum, in 1891 on capital and labor. In the wake of the Industrial Revolution, this teaching focused on the rights and dignities of laborers and called for the protection of private property, private associations, as well as a preferential option for the poor, the universal destination of goods, and a just wage. Over the last century or so, teachings on economic justice have persisted as central to the concerns of the Catholic Church, with the U.S. bishops publishing a pastoral letter entitled Economic Justice for All in 1986, in which they addressed each one of us, asking, how will my economic decisions serve human dignity and the common good? On the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, Pope John Paul II delivered the encyclical Centesimus Annus to all people of goodwill, renewing the Church's teachings on economic justice and urging a preferential option for the poor as an ethical imperative. Most recently, Pope Francis, in his apostolic letter Evangelii Gaudium, sounded the alarm on economic injustice, noting that inequality and poverty undermine an inclusive and participatory democracy and the realization of a common good. Quote, just as the commandment, thou shalt not kill, is set as a clear limit in order to safeguard the value of human life, today we also have to say, thou shalt not, to an economy of exclusion and inequality. Such an economy kills. The culture of prosperity deadens us. The dignity of each human person and the pursuit of the common good are concerns which ought to shape all economic policies. When these values are threatened, a prophetic voice must be raised, end quote. Today we're joined by Professor Nikki Santos of the Society of Jesus, a prophetic voice, indeed, addressing the moral margins of poverty and prosperity and advancing an integrative justice model in business. Father Santos is assistant professor of marketing in the business school at Marquette University, a Jesuit priest and co-director of Marquette's Social Innovation Initiative, as well as co-chair of the Catholic Relief Services Global Campus Initiative. He has degrees in philosophy, theology, and business, and practical experience in both the for-profit and non-for-profit organizations. After earning his PhD, he spent 3 years here at Santa Clara as a postdoctoral fellow and visiting scholar in the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics, and as program chair for the Global Social Benefit Incubator Network workshop and reviewer for the Global Social Benefit Fellowship in what is now the Miller Center. He was also involved with Step Up Silicon Valley, a Catholic Charities Initiative campaign to end poverty in Silicon Valley, serving as the chair of the Incomes Issue Group and then as co-chair of the Incubation Committee. He has published widely in both business journals and in mission-related journals in higher education, and we're thrilled to welcome him back to campus for today's lecture. Following Professor Santos's lecture, we'll have a brief response from Professor Bill Sundstrom, as well as time for conversation and exchange. Professor Sundstrom is in the Economics Department in the Levy School of Business here at Santa Clara and serves as Bannon Faculty Fellow in the Ignatian Center, chairing the Bannon Faculty Collaborative on Economic Justice and the Common Good. His current research investigates the causes and consequences of poverty and income inequality in the Silicon Valley region, as well as relevant policy responses. So to begin, please join me now in welcoming Professor Nikki Santos for our 2017 Bannon Memorial Lecture, The Moral Margins of Poverty and Prosperity Towards an Integrative Justice Model in Business. Father Santos.
Thank you, Teresa, for that very kind introduction. In terms of an overview, I'm going to provide a little bit of context, and then I will elaborate a little bit on the integrative justice model with a brief summary of Catholic social teaching. I will share the results of a short survey that we had conducted, and then discuss the applicability of the integrative justice model to the field of social entrepreneurship. But first, as Teresa mentioned, I did spend 3 wonderful years here at Santa Clara. And that experience was really made possible because of 3 people who I would like to acknowledge. The first is unfortunately no longer with us, former president and chancellor of the university, Father Paul Locatelli. In a keynote address at the joint meeting of the International Association of Jesuit Business Schools and the Colleagues of Jesuit Business Education at Fordham University in 2008, Father Locatelli spoke about Santa Clara's efforts at promoting a humane capitalism, of creating a just and sustainable world. I think he was referring to the work of the Miller Center for Social Entrepreneurship, which was at that time the Center for Science, Technology, and Society. But Father Locatelli's speech kind of resonated with me because that was the focus of my dissertation, creating just and sustainable marketplaces, particularly for impoverished populations. At that meeting was another person from Santa Clara, Kirk Hansen, the executive director of the Markkula Center. I was also impressed with Kirk's presentation, which focused on the 5 distinctive characteristics of Jesuit business education, one of which was a preferential option for the poor. And then, of course, I was honored to have Kirk attend my presentation, after which he extended an invitation to me to come to Santa Clara as a visiting scholar at the Ethics Center. Of course, I was really excited about that, given the fact that I was really excited about what was going on over here. And so I approached my provincial back in India, because I belonged to the Indian province of Pune at that time, and I managed to get permission to come as a visiting scholar to the Ethics Center. But there was a problem. There was no room at the inn. The Jesuit community at Santa Clara over here was full, and so they had no place. And so Father Locatelli, who was based in Rome at that time, he intervened on my behalf with the rector of the Jesuit community, and I was allowed to apply to be a resident minister, which I did, and my interviewer was none other than Teresa Ladrigan-Webley, who was the director of resident ministry at that time. Now, if Teresa had failed me in her interview, I would not have been able to come here and likely would not be delivering this lecture here today. But the reason I share this with you is because in the spirit of the Ignatian Center, I'm amazed at how the Spirit works in our life. If it was not for these 3 people, I would not have had the tremendous experiences and rich encounters that I had with people at the Markkula Center, the Miller Center, the Business School, the Justice and the Arts Initiative, campus ministry, other areas of the university, and in the local community. Teresa mentioned my involvement with Step Up Silicon Valley, and I just want to share with you again how that came to be another example of the working of the Spirit. There was a retired diocesan priest, Father Larry Largente, who passed away a little while ago, who was a regular at the Jesuit Community Evening Mass. Once we got chatting, and I was sharing with him my area of research, and his eyes immediately lit up, and he said, I should introduce you to a friend of mine, a person by the name of Terry Iacino, who is heading this initiative called Step Up Silicon Valley, which Catholic Charities has just launched. And so we met. Step Up at that time was organized around issue areas, such as hunger, education, housing, etc. And each issue area was headed by a leader who would convene meetings of a group that would be committed to working in that particular area. One issue that did not have a leader was the income issue area, which was a very important area. And so after hearing about my research and my background, Terry seemed to think that I would be a right fit, and so she kind of extended to me the invitation to head that particular area. One of the people whose kind of help I sought early on was a lady by the name of Almaz Nagash, who I came to know through the Ethics Center. And I don't think Almaz is here, but she was going to be here. Is she here? She's coming. Okay, she's coming. She's late. She's running late. But so I got Almaz in, but Almaz now heads Step Up Silicon Valley, and she has done an incredible job of taking this initiative forward. My experience with Step Up was one, of course, it was a challenge to work across organizations, but also working with Step Up made me realize the extent of poverty in Silicon Valley. I was aware of the poverty in Oakland because I spent a year at the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley over there, which is now part of Santa Clara University. But Silicon Valley came across as a relatively well-off area. After all, it was Silicon Valley, the technology capital of the world. And so, one easily assumes that the booming tech industry is a sign of prosperity in the valley. Unfortunately, it is also the cause of rising poverty. Extremely high rent costs and the increased cost of living push many people into the poverty bracket. The Department of Health and Human Services, in their 2017 poverty guidelines published at the end of January this year, show the poverty threshold for a family or a household with 4 persons to be about 24,600. Interestingly, the level for Hawaii is 28,290, and for Alaska, 30,750. But even the Alaska threshold is still way low for Silicon Valley. An article by Olivia Solon on February 27, 2017 in The Guardian reveals that many tech workers earning 6-figure annual incomes still consider themselves poor in the valley. The high cost of living in Silicon Valley is not only contributing to an increase in poverty and homelessness in Silicon Valley, but it is also having a spillover effect on neighboring rural areas in the Central Valley, such as Modesto and Patterson. There was an article just a few days ago, on April 13, 2017, also in The Guardian, by Lauren Hepler, which reveals the rise of homelessness in these counties because people from Silicon Valley are now moving to these areas, for lower rents, but it's pushing the rent costs in those places much higher. This juxtapositioning of rising prosperity as well as rising poverty that we witness in Silicon Valley and its neighboring areas provides a good context for my talk this evening. Previous speakers of the Bannon Institute, such as Father Matt Carnes, S.J., and Professor Bill Sundstrom, have pointed out the economic inequalities of our present times. In January 2016, a few weeks prior to Father Khan's address, Oxfam International, in their briefing report, mentioned that in the year 2015, 62 individuals owned the same amount of wealth as the bottom 3.6 billion people, or half of the world's population. This year, in January 2017, a few weeks prior to Professor Sundstrom's talk, Oxfam updated its findings with new and better data that showed that instead of 62 people, it was just 8 men who own the same amount of wealth as 3.6 billion people. The immensity of this disparity is astounding and mind-boggling, so much so that the issue of inequality featured at the center of the discussions at the World Economic Forum in Davos earlier this year. While the number of people living in extreme poverty fell below 10% in 2015, the unfortunate reality of our time and of our common home is that of a substantial number of people around the world who struggle to make ends meet, who lack adequate nutrition, access to education, sanitation, clean water, and even shelter. These people constitute what has been labeled the base or bottom of the pyramid segment. Traditionally, marketers shied away from this population as they were perceived to have little purchasing power and thus an unattractive market segment. As a result, this population was underserved as well as bore the brunt of, ironically, paying more for products and services, what is called the poverty premium. Think about a 3,000 plus percentage annualized interest rate on loans, or rent-to-own products that work out to be many times more than the actual cost of the product. The impetus for multinational corporations to market to the poor was largely provided by analysis demonstrating that there was now an emerging profit potential in low-income markets. The first such comprehensive argument was provided by Professors C.K. Prahalad and Stuart Hart in an article in Strategy Plus Business in 2002, in which, with the help of case examples, they pointed out that low-income markets provided big companies the opportunities of amassing their fortunes, as well as bringing prosperity to the world's poor. In a later work titled Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid in 2005, Professor Prahalad claimed that the collective fortune to be made in these markets was in the vicinity of about 13 trillion US dollars. I stumbled across Professor Prahalad's work while researching possible topics for my doctoral dissertation. At that time, I was largely interested in nonprofit marketing, or even something in church marketing. But there was something that drew me to Professor Prahalad's book. Professor Prahalad made some good points, such as the poor have legitimate needs, they are brand conscious, and that they are underserved. However, the idea of a fortune to be made at the bottom of the pyramid was a bit troubling to me. I thought that if big companies were going to be attracted to this segment only because of the fortune to be reaped, there was the possibility of a greater exploitation of poor and disadvantaged consumers. Historic business involvement with low-income consumers has been rife with a plethora of unethical and exploitative practices, such as predatory lending, tainted insurance, unconscionable labor practices, and exorbitant rent-to-own transactions. In conversations with my doctoral guide, Professor Jean Lasnak, we thought it might be a useful contribution to develop a normative, ethical framework for fair and just engagement with impoverished populations. This, of course, meant changing the direction of my work. Thanks to Ignatian spirituality and the tool of discernment, I was able to pray over this, and I did surrender to that change of direction. With regard to theory building, we used a normative theory building protocol advocated by the philosopher John Bishop. I'm not going to go into the details of that theory building, except that two components were the recommended values and the grounds for accepting those values. The primary question was, how can market exchange situations that are directed at impoverished segments be better shaped in order to be fair and just to both parties, that is, the business and the consumer, but especially the poor? So I considered 13 different frameworks or theories, and just to give you a brief idea of what these were, as you can see, so they are virtue ethics, Sir William Ross's theory of duties, Jürgen Habermas's discourse theory, Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, John Rawls's theory of justice, classical utilitarianism, Amartya Sen's capability approach, stakeholder theory, the triple bottom line, sustainability, socially responsible investing, service dominant logic of marketing, and Catholic social teaching. So a huge kind of array of frameworks that I looked into. And though listed last, at the Catholic social teaching was really the first framework I looked into and studied in depth, perhaps because of my religious affiliation and vocation. So permit me, in the spirit of this institute, permit me to share a little bit and give a little background about Catholic social teaching. For those not familiar with it, I see a lot of Jesuits in the room, so please forgive me. So Catholic social teaching really comprises of the tradition of papal, church council, and episcopal documents that deal with the church's response and commitment to the social demands of the gospel in the context of the world. While CST is rooted in scripture and founded on the life and teachings of Jesus, a generally accepted starting point of this tradition dates to Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum in 1891, a moral commentary inspired by several of the social abuses rooted in the Industrial Revolution. At the heart of CST are four principles that are referred to as the permanent principles of the Church's social doctrine. These are the dignity of the human person, the common good, subsidiarity, and solidarity. While the four principles are interrelated and are intended to be appreciated in their unity, a foundational principle is that of the dignity of the human person. In fact, the whole of CST unfolds from this first principle. Basically, what the Church affirms is that human life is sacred, and human beings, by virtue of being created in God's image, have a certain inviolable dignity. This dignity is not something that is acquired by one's efforts, but rather it is a given. In other words, all human persons, regardless of race, color, and creed, possess an inherent dignity of being in the likeness of God, and therefore righteously should be accorded full respect. The second principle, namely the principle of the common good, in its broad sense is understood as the social conditions that enable individuals or groups to attain their fulfillment more easily. A significant implication of the principle of the common good is that of the universal destination of goods. This implies that the goods of the earth have been given by God for all to use. Thus, all have a right to benefit from these goods. As CST points out, this does not mean that everything is at the disposal of each person or of all people, or that the same object may be useful or belong to each person or all people. However, it does mean that each person must have access to the level of well-being necessary for his or her full development. While CST clearly upholds the right to private property, it also requires that all people have equal access to the ownership of goods. The third principle is that of subsidiarity, which holds that it is an injustice and at the same time a grave evil and disturbance of right order to assign to a greater and higher association what lesser and subordinate organizations can do. A major implication of subsidiarity is that of participation, expressed as a series of activities through which individuals, either in their own capacity or in association with others, contribute to the various dimensions of life in the community to which they belong. And the fourth principle, namely that of solidarity, affirms the intrinsic social nature of the human person and the awareness of the interdependence between individuals and peoples. Solidarity is not just a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of so many people, both far and near. On the contrary, it is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. The term solidarity, as used by the teaching authority of the Church, expresses in summary fashion the need to recognize in the composite ties that unite men and social groups among themselves the space given to human freedom for common growth in which all share and in which they participate. An important requirement of the principle of solidarity is that of a greater awareness that all of us are debtors to the society to which we belong. We are debtors because of the condition that make human existence livable, and because of the indivisible and indispensable legacy constituted by culture, scientific and technical knowledge, material and immaterial goods, and by all that the human condition has produced. Now, a fundamental economic assumption made in the theory of exchange is that both parties to the exchange are on an equal footing, which is very often not the case. And it is precisely because of the inequalities that exist in the exchange process that we see an ever-increasing amount of injustices. And therefore, a major challenge in the construction of just markets is of creating economic win-win situations for all participants. So reflecting on the notion of fairness or equity in marketing transactions involving impoverished populations from the perspective of the four foundational principles of CST, as well as in the other 12 frameworks, there were 5 key elements that emerged. These are an authentic engagement with consumers, particularly impoverished ones, with non-exploitative intent. The second was co-creation of value with customers, especially those who are impoverished or disadvantaged. The third, an investment in future consumption without endangering the environment. The fourth, interest representation of all stakeholders, particularly impoverished customers. And the fifth, a focus on long-term profit management rather than short-term profit maximization. So instead of kind of discussing the theoretical derivation of each of these key elements, I would like to briefly elaborate a little bit on each one of them. So the first one is an authentic engagement with consumers, particularly impoverished ones, with non-exploitative intent. The corporate scandals at the turn of the century, the financial meltdown in 2008, and the continued corporate abuses, such as the Volkswagen emission case, continued to contribute to a fundamental breakdown of trust in corporations. An important means of restoring this trust, particularly with impoverished customers, is of engaging them with non-exploitative intent. An authentic engagement is one that should possess the intrinsic quality of being trustworthy, as well as be a process that aims at winning the trust of the constituents engaged. Professor Samley, in his book, Globalization from the Bottom Up, makes the distinction between greed and ambition. A company motivated by greed will attempt to win in any way, shape, or form, get as much for themselves as they can, and move as fast as they can get it, paying little heed to the external environment. In contrast, an ambitious company realizes that working and collaborating with others increases opportunities for progress and benefits a larger number of people. The Aravind Eye Care system in India, whose mission is to eradicate needless blindness by providing appropriate, compassionate, and high-quality care for all, is a good example of an organization that authentically engages consumers without intending to exploit them. The second key element is co-creation of value with customers, especially those who are impoverished or disadvantaged. Co-creation of value is an emerging approach in marketing which holds that instead of autonomously positing what constitutes value for consumers, a business firm ought to involve such consumers in the value creation process itself. One of the easiest ways to generate creative and ethical symbiosis and to avoid negative outcomes is to partner with impoverished customers from the very beginning. For example, Aman's Abantu Services, a South African provider of water and sanitation services, involves consumers from the beginning of the innovation process itself. A direct inquiry process conducted during the incubation phase enables customers to seek the design of the sanitation structure. Additionally, rural, community-based village groups called project steering committees were set up to enable the villagers to play an active role in the project's design and implementation, thereby leading to greater ownership. Such an open innovation paradigm grants consumers the role of a prosumer, integrating him or her actively and deeply in one or ideally all stages of the innovation process: invention, incubation, market introduction, and diffusion. The third key element is an investment in future consumption without endangering the environment. One of the fears of expanded marketing to impoverished market segments, particularly in developing countries, is that an exponential increase in overall consumption could have dire consequences on an already battered planet. However, a major assumption made is that present production patterns will be used to support such expansion, which need not be the case. There are numerous examples of disruptive innovations, such as in solar energy or mobile phones. Mobile phones, for instance, have enabled poor customers in rural areas to have access to modern technology, and it has eliminated the need to set up phone cables and connections in these rural areas. But the investment in future consumption element should be seen as encompassing more than merely proposing a budget for increasing consumption. It is really linked with Amartya Sen's idea of expanding the capabilities and freedoms of people, and is really proposing a better participation of the impoverished in the market system. The fourth key element of the integrated justice model is an interest representation of all stakeholders, particularly impoverished customers. Harvard researchers Rangan and McAfee, in a book chapter titled Globalization and the Poor, they argue that one of the reasons why the trillions of dollars spent on development aid have hardly made a dent in global poverty is because the interests of the poor were never sufficiently considered. And the interests of the poor were never even brought to the table of policymaking and decisions. In addition to the interests of the shareholders, companies need to consider the interests of other stakeholders, particularly those who do not have much voice in the economic negotiation process. Considering the interests of the often voiceless, impoverished consumer is in accordance with the principle of the common good and the principle of subsidiarity. And the last key element of the integrated justice model is a focus on long-term profit management rather than short-term profit maximization. Catholic social teaching recognizes the legitimate role of profits in the functioning of a business enterprise. However, a preoccupation with profitability, ironically, can act against the long-term interests of the business organization. Such a preoccupation is largely the outcome of a short-term mentality that is driven by quarterly profit increments or even annual return on investment targets. The pressure for short-term profit maximization can lead to various forms of unethical business behavior, as evidenced by the corporate scandals that continue to break out. According to CST, the individual profit of a business enterprise should never become the sole objective of a company. Rather, it should be considered together with another equally fundamental objective, namely social usefulness. A company is more likely to consider its social usefulness when it has a long-term rather than a short-term perspective. If companies are intent merely on short-term profit maximization, they will be first and foremost reluctant to enter impoverished markets because of the low purchasing power of these consumers and various barriers to entry, such as inadequate infrastructure, lack of knowledge of these markets, etc. Secondly, if they do enter this market, because so many in impoverished segments have low literacy and minimal economic choices and education, corporations will be tempted to indulge in exploitative practices that will further disadvantage the impoverished customers. Instead, if companies take a long-term profit management perspective, they will view these markets as a source of opportunity, of innovation, and competitive advantage. Further, they will be less prone towards being exploitative, as it makes little sense to exploit a segment whose growth is vital to the company's own long-term success. Taking a long-term view also enables a company to support local communities in their holistic development, as such development is beneficial to the company in the long run. Then one of the things we did was, to assess the managerial perceptions of the integrative justice model, we collected primary data from marketers and managers in both for and nonprofit organizations in the United States and abroad. The sample size was small. It was about 118, with about 46% from for-profit corporations and about 25% from nonprofits and social entrepreneurs. 78% were US-based and the remaining from overseas. Overall, the data that we collected indicated support for the constructs of the IGM, but in fact, they pointed out, and using factor analysis, there was another factor that emerged, was the construct of amplifying the voice of the poor consumer. Somehow that came out a little bit more strongly than what we have in the 5 key elements. It's probably contained in some of them, like co-creation and interest representation, but this idea of amplifying the voice of the poor consumer was something that came out from this survey, which I think is an important kind of area. I just want to move then to the application of the integrated justice model to the field of social entrepreneurship. Over the last decade or so, there has been a phenomenal growth in the field of social entrepreneurship, ably demonstrating how technology, innovation, and an entrepreneurial spirit can afford better solutions to the vexing social and environmental problems of our time than can traditional aid and charity-based efforts. While there is no clear-cut definition of social entrepreneurship, a key differentiator is that in the case of social entrepreneurship, the primary value accrues to society rather than to the individual or the organization. The Miller Center, and we have a few representatives from Miller Center over here, have played and continue to play an important and significant role in helping social enterprises all over the world, including the United States, to have a greater impact in achieving their objectives. I've been privileged to work with the Miller Center. In fact, Marquette has a MOU with Santa Clara and the Miller Center, and we have used the Global Social Benefit Institute Boost curriculum for early stage social entrepreneurs in Milwaukee. Social entrepreneurs are playing a significant role in making available off-the-grid energy solutions, clean cooking and water technologies, healthcare advancements, sustainable livelihoods, etc. As social entrepreneurship is aimed at solving social problems, an assumption that is made is that all is good and ethical and fair. And as such, there has been no and not much research or publications on ethical issues in social entrepreneurship. A special issue of the Journal of Business Ethics in February 2016 on social entrepreneurship and business ethics, and I think that's probably the only special issue that I've come across on this topic, asks the question whether social equals ethical. And as the articles and issues kind of suggest, that is not always the case. In applying the integrated justice model to the field of social entrepreneurship, and this was for a special issue on social entrepreneurship in another journal, but wasn't on ethics, that was edited by Thane Kreiner from the Miller Center, there were a few modifications that were made to the model, such as focusing on an authentic engagement that was aimed at empowerment and a value creation that aimed at solving the root causes of problems associated with poverty. The application of the IGM to social entrepreneurship also generated some points that managers of social enterprises ought to consider, and you see a couple up on the screen. And these are a couple of questions. To what extent are our processes and functioning aimed at empowering the constituencies we engage? Is there a system in place for shared control and succession planning? Do we co-create solutions with our target groups? To what degree do we collaborate with other social entrepreneurial organizations, those within the same sector we operate in, and those in other sectors? What is the composition of the decision makers? Are the voices of marginalized groups included in decision making? How does our business plan ensure financial stability, not just for the present, but also for the foreseeable future? So I began with highlighting the issue of inequality. And as Teresa mentioned, Pope Francis and other popes have also spoken a lot on the issue of inequality. However, as an article in this past weekend's Wall Street Journal argues, inequality isn't the real issue. The real issue is fairness. I hope that the integrated justice model that I just shared inspires you, inspires business practitioners, inspires social entrepreneurs to reflect on the conditions of a marketplace that presently include too many vulnerable people who lack bargaining power. Whether they are residents of rural India, a Brazilian favela, or a recent US immigrant scraping together a coach fare for a visit back home to see their elderly mother, they require the assurance of fairness when securing their economic needs. The integrated justice model represents some essential ideals of fair exchange against which current selling practices to poor consumer segments can be measured. Awareness of the IGM is a small and hopefully helpful step for those involved with impoverished customers in aiding that process. I would like to end with an excerpt from Pope Francis' TED Talk delivered from the Vatican at the TED event in Vancouver last month. This is all planned, the Pope's TED Talk, the Wall Street Journal, and then I would have this talk. But here I quote Pope Francis. Hope is the virtue of a heart that doesn't lock itself into darkness, that doesn't dwell on the past, does not simply get by in the present, but is able to see a tomorrow. Hope is the door that opens onto the future. Hope is a humble, hidden seed of life that with time will develop into a large tree. It is like some invisible yeast that allows the whole dough to grow, that brings flavor to all aspects of life. And it can do so much because a tiny flicker of light that feeds on hope is enough to shatter the shield of darkness. A single individual is enough for hope to exist, and that individual can be you. And then there will be another you, and another you, and it turns into an us. And so, does hope begin when we have an us? No. Hope began with one you. When there is an us, there begins a revolution. My dear friends, thank you for being here, and thank you for being part of this revolution. With that, we'll now have Bill kind of offering a few remarks.
Great, thank you all for coming, and thanks to Teresa and the Bannon Institute for bringing us together for this really stimulating talk, and thanks especially to Nikki Santos for coming back to Santa Clara University to give us this stimulating presentation. I'm just delighted to welcome him back. I actually interacted with Nikki a fair amount during his brief 3 years here, and in fact it was through him that I got to know the work of Step Up Silicon Valley, and I've been involved in various ways with their work ever since. So I guess that's another us, another we. I'd like to offer a few reflections on Nikki's main points in light of some of the themes that we're developing in this Bannon Institute on the common good and economic justice issues this quarter. We'll then proceed to a brief dialogue on a couple of points, and then looking forward to all of your participation, questions, and comments. I think this talk really addresses a fundamental issue for our time, and I would characterize it, with the possible exception of some of the elements at the end, as the question of what is the role of business or business models in alleviating global poverty and promoting economic justice and sustainable development. Or we might just say in promoting the common good. It's a fundamental issue, and not only because justice and sustainability are essential concerns of our time, but also because the central place of business itself as an institution and sometimes a set of values is really unavoidable, I think, in the modern global capitalist economy, whether everyone likes it or not. Now, one well-known view asserts a compatibility between profit-seeking business activity and the common good, specifically that commerce drives economic growth, and economic growth in turn broadens and deepens prosperity. This is an idea that goes all the way back to Adam, in fact. And of course, you know I'm referring to Adam Smith, who's one of the spiritual founders of my particular sect, the economists. Of course, if you have read your Adam, and I hope you all have, you know that his views were rather more nuanced and less sanguine about capitalist enterprise than they're often credited with being. Importantly, the benefits of commerce, in his view, require the discipline of competition. Monopoly and collusion undermine not only fairness, but also growth and efficiency. Interestingly, in Smith's view, monopoly and collusion, what he referred to as conspiracy, are usually the product of misguided government policies that favor or protect economic special interests, in his view, usually the rich, and undermine what he called a system of natural liberty. And I want to return to this question of the role of government and the state in the economic justice questions surrounding business in a moment. Today, 2.5 centuries after Smith's great work in economics, I think we appreciate that while global commerce and rapid economic growth in many parts of the world have had important benefits, including poverty reduction on a massive scale in many parts of the world, they are hardly a panacea. And Nikki notes, I think, a number of the issues: the persistence of dire poverty and economic disadvantage in many parts of the world. He also notes that rapid economic growth can itself have paradoxical consequences, or seemingly paradoxical consequences, such as the increase in economic hardship for many that's been associated with skyrocketing housing costs in places such as Silicon Valley. And of course, we also are well aware now more than ever, I think, of the fact that unfettered economic growth, emphasizing short-run gains, is often incompatible with long-run environmental sustainability. A conventional modern response, I think, to these concerns would be to argue for a progressive activist role for government in redistribution and regulation. Perhaps some would call it socialism or something like that. This places the focus of economic justice on politics and policy advocacy. But I think a look around the world, especially in the last year or two, raises many doubts about this strategy. What if government is unable or unwilling, ineffectual, incompetent, or even wicked? Can business itself perhaps help fill the gap between justice and an incompetent or dysfunctional state in many parts of the world? Is there a feasible role for ethical business principles and practices, whether by multinational corporations or small-scale entrepreneurs and everything in between? Can doing good be compatible with doing well in terms of the bottom line? These are old questions. They're questions that are currently being asked by many, as they have been, including some of my colleagues in the Levy School of Business, where we're starting to offer programs and courses in conscientious capitalism. I know there are people out there saying that that's an oxymoron, but you might think that. I couldn't possibly say so. In his integrative justice model, Nicky Santos applies the framework of Catholic social teaching to these kinds of questions, and it's a fascinating set of results. And he arrives at a set of business principles that may offer a win-win situation for all participants, from the struggling poor to the striving capitalist. And these are what he characterized in his talk as ideals of fair exchange. He identifies those 5 key elements in this model that he referred to during the talk, and at the risk of some oversimplification, I want to sort of distill them down to, I had sort of 2 takeaway categories. And the first of those is that businesses must engage in genuine interaction and collaboration with their customers, and thinking of customers in a very broad sense, but in particular, the economically disadvantaged. And this included the authentic engagement without the intention to exploit, co-creation or partnering with the folks who you are doing business with, and giving a genuine voice to all stakeholders, essentially giving a much more central role to the customers and clients in the process of business. And secondly, that the goal of business must be long-run sustainability, both economically or financially and environmentally. And I think, as he amply demonstrated, these elements all speak to really important values of Catholic social teaching, the preferential option for the poor, serving the common good, among others, subsidiarity, as he spoke to, and they speak very eloquently to a number of the concerns that Pope Francis raised in Laudato Si, as well as many other writings of his. He also offers some excellent examples of these principles in action, including the growing support of social entrepreneurship right here at SCU. Our own Miller Center is, of course, striving to produce and support social entrepreneurs who will implement objectives that I think are a lot along the lines that he raises. Now, but I also was happy to hear the notes of skepticism, in particular, the question of whether the social in social entrepreneurship equals ethical, right? So what do we know about that? And he suggests that some of the rather small amount of evidence that we have available suggests that at least this is not always the case, right? I think there's a couple reasons why the social intention in business doesn't always equal the ethical. One is simply that many social entrepreneurs may fail to employ or embody all the principles of this kind of integrative justice model, or conscientious capitalism, or whatever you want to call it, whether that's through intent, that some things are to be ignored, or just through oversight. I want to add another reason, though, that comes from my own background as an economist, and that is that entrepreneurs of all sorts, business people, whatever their good intentions and their good training in ethical business practices, compete out there with a lot of less scrupulous capitalist sharks, if you like, who seem to thrive in the global waters of competitive capitalism. Nikki asserts that business people can do well by doing good, this kind of win-win, and I think perhaps we can find a number of examples where it's true. But if those sharks, and I'm a fan of sharks, not the hockey players, I don't care about that, but the fish. So I don't wish to I shouldn't really use this term for them. But if the sharks can do better by doing badder, shall we say, the market will reward them for it. And this is an old story in capitalism. And this is especially likely to be in areas where the sort of the Smith optimism about the market breaks down. And that would include where there are elements of the common good at stake, such as equal opportunity, fairness, or environmental degradation. Those are places where even hard-hearted economists expect that the market is not going to be functioning properly. Thus, I think just as we ought to be concerned in the area of state function or governmental function about a race to the bottom across political jurisdictions in areas like labor standards and environmental policy, we also need to, when we think about the role of business in the common good, we need to think about or concern ourselves with the possibility of a race to the bottom in business practices as well, especially under competitive pressures among businesses and entrepreneurs. I have to say then, this leaves me on a kind of skeptical and perhaps pessimistic note. I'm not terribly sanguine about the prospects of the state stepping in and furthering the kinds of values and goals that I think a lot of us would share. I'm not so sanguine about the role of the market in enforcing the common good across, whether through competitive processes or others. I do want to mention, and I think this also comes out in Nikki's talk as well, one element or one set of institutions that I think often gets left out of the conversation to a degree, but he's certainly bringing it back in, and I'd like to propose it as well. And that's what I'm going to call very broadly civil society. So if we think of the institutions of government and the state on one hand, and perhaps for-profit business and economic organizations on the other. We, of course, live in a world which has a whole host of other third sort of institutions that come under this rubric of civil society, non-governmental, non-commercial. And I would include among those, of course, universities, where we are here, the press, a variety of non-governmental organizations, religious institutions, advocacy organizations, etc. Such institutions, I think, have an increasingly important role to play in developing, promulgating, and monitoring the kinds of values and practices that Nikki has emphasized here today in both business and government. I'd also note that, as many of us are aware, they're also highly under attack in many parts of the world and certainly deserving of our support and protection. So as we move into the next part of the presentation today, certainly I'd like to engage Nikki as well as the rest of you on some of these issues. What are the conditions under which we can make these kinds of values and principles actually work on a scalable level in the world we live in today under the sets of political and economic constraints that we're all well aware of. So on that note, I will cut it off here and invite Nikki up to engage in a little bit of dialogue, and then welcome your comments and questions as well. Thank you.
This is very exposed. Yeah, conscientious capitalism, I love that.
Well, let me just kick it off with a couple questions that maybe get your reaction to a couple of things, if I think I'm on here. You know, one way that your talk really echoed a lot of things that I remember back in the day reading about in college and beyond is sort of the old idea of corporate social responsibility. And, you know, I think there's always been a lot of mixed feelings about that notion, in part because, you know, some people, you know, Milton Friedman, the conservative economist famously said, you know, the social responsibility of business is to make money. The rest of us who think businesses ought to behave ethically and socially worry that it becomes a kind of a smokescreen for kind of greenwashing behavior, et cetera. So I'm curious what you think about thinking about this kind of integrative social justice model for business and for social entrepreneurs in light of what we know about social responsibility.
Yeah, so there was an article in 2012, I think in the Wall Street Journal by Anil Karnani, who was revisiting that whole same, like the only responsibility of business is to its shareholders, and they felt that anything other than that is a distraction for the company. But by and large, I think you know, a lot of companies kind of, they get the idea that it's not just our investors who we are responsible to. If we really want to be successful, we need to be in successful and you know, thriving communities. And for that, kind of like, you know, how do we engage in that? But I think the conversation has moved from like we just throw money to charity to how do we kind of get this as part of who we are. And so I know that, you know, to give a very good example of a company, a global company that is over the years really invested a lot in changing its whole model, is the yogurt company Danone or Danone or whatever. I mean, you know, but D-A-N-O-N-E. But they've invested a lot in trying to change their whole model of doing business, so that you know, it's almost like a social business, that they kind of like, you know, they keep the social aspect in terms of addressing some of these issues. So they've been involved with you know, Grameen in Bangladesh in providing nutritional yogurt. So addressing again the issue of nutrition, but through their product. But so, you know, having a business model that's kind of that's successful and sustainable. That's something that even Michael Porter, you know, from Harvard has been talking about, of moving from, you know, from corporate social responsibility to kind of to more kind of creating shared value. And so we talk a lot about this whole thing of creating shared value today. So I see, you know, in terms of there are good examples of companies that do kind of follow, you know, quite a few of the integrated justice model elements. So.
Just one other quick question. I'd really like to turn it over to the audience soon. In terms of the concerns about state corruption and the difficulties of doing business, but also the challenges of corrupt business practices, I wonder how you think about sort of navigating those questions, the role between social entrepreneurship and integrative justice models in a world that has very imperfect rules of the game that have to be navigated.
True, and actually you answered that question, because you brought in the whole, you know, the point about civil society and of, you know, of people who already kind of have taken the lead on some of these things. So, for example, when, you know, Trump appointed Steve Pruitt as the director of the EPA, there was a lot of concern from many groups in terms of, like, you know, what's going to happen to this whole thing of climate change. But a lot of companies have already kind of like, you know, they've already put into place policies for in terms of sustainable development. And so, you know, most of the major companies are talking about closed loop manufacturing. They're talking of kind of reducing their carbon footprint. There's already, you know, just having somebody appointed as head of EPA is not going to change a lot of these perspectives. And I think, of course, there's also the pressure from civil society. I think, in that respect, I think also the growth of social entrepreneurship has been good, because it's kind of almost like it's coming from the bottom up, and it's kind of creating change, which is almost civil society change.
Okay, this is my last question. which is on behalf of the students in the audience, which is short of getting involved and engaged in, say, the Miller Center and learning about social entrepreneurship or related things in terms of conscientious capitalism, for the students who are going to go out in the world and be in a kind of a standard business enterprise setting, perhaps, what words of advice do you give them about how to start thinking about actually engaging with the kinds of concerns and actions that you're talking about here? What can they start to do? How do they get started in their careers?
I'm sure the students in the room over here will agree that, as part of your Jesuit education over here, you have been kind of formed in this whole concern for others, and that makes a big difference. Our tagline at Marquette is "Be the difference," but really be the difference in making the world a better place, not making it worse. But so I think, in terms of I think a lot of in all our institutions, a lot of the engagement that we have with our students in the local community in issues of making them come in contact with issues of poverty and of some of these issues helps them in framing what they do in the business world. Kind of so I think and I'm hopeful that as students go out into the business world, that you don't get sucked in by the cultures you all move to, but that you can kind of be a critical, important voice, for fairness and equity in the world and for making the world a better place. I mean, as Pope Francis said, the only development we can really talk about is a development that includes everybody, and I think that's important for all of us. That as we kind of, if we really want to make the world a better place, we should be committed to whatever we do, that this is really, in some form or way, making the world a better place for everybody, and not just for a few.
Why don't we turn it over to the audience and get some questions? Do you want to pick them, or maybe I'll just go ahead? Right here? Yeah.
First of all, I like your IJM model a lot, and you gave a nice example of a company using that model and doing well with it. But I guess I'm also curious, like Professor Sundstrom said, how will this model do in a competitive environment? So when a purely capitalist business says, I want to produce the same thing that you're producing, how will it win in the market? And I pose this question not as a skeptic, so much as an optimist. I have a lot of hope that a model like IJM will win out in the market eventually. I think that goes back to my own Catholic roots and a firm belief in the idea that love wins in the end. But I'd like you to, if you could take a moment and just flesh that out. What does it look like, a capitalist firm competing with an IJM firm and the IJM firm winning? What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses?
Well, I think the whole notion of collaboration is much more there than what we would like to imagine. When we think of even competition, we think of firms totally kind of competing with one another at cutthroat competition. Maybe that's what people see. I discovered when I was teaching marketing back in India, there was a group that was doing a study on Coca-Cola and Pepsi, and they were both coming in and they were killing one another. And they were like, wait a minute, actually they use the same warehouses for keeping their goods. They use the same for the supply chain. They were actually these big companies, cutthroat companies, were actually collaborating on many fronts because they realized that actually collaboration helps them. The same thing with phone companies. All right, for if each phone company has their own cell towers and all the space, it kind of increases the cost phenomenally. If you're able to share that, you're going to be more in terms of beneficial and profitable than just kind of competing. But just to your point, in terms of this whole notion of you have to be competitive to be successful, you got to learn from the poor. And so when we were in Ghana and we were visiting a group of women, self-help group, and it was kind of a savings and lending group, and they would kind of collect money and then try to help each of them be entrepreneurs. They were all kind of most of them were creating the same product. And we were trying to tell them, you're creating the same product, you're going to the market, you're sitting over there, all of you all with the same product. Why don't you all make something different so you'll compete with one another? How do you compete, right? You're making the same product. And they said, oh no, they don't mind. Like, they said it's fine. This thing, they have their own relationship with people that they can and they could kind of relate to. And that was for me like, said, oh, okay, that's a different kind of a business model. And so who am I to kind of go and say like, that's a totally wrong business model that you have? Because, and again, growing up in India, we see the same thing. You'll have rows of people selling the same vegetables, and I think, why are they all selling the same vegetable? There's something different, right? But they are fine with it, and if they run out of a particular vegetable, they'll either go to somebody else and get it for you. It's kind of like it's a different strategy, and I think it's important for us to think that you don't need to always kind of kill each other,
Hi, my name is Long, and I teach international business in the Levy School. And I actually used your IJM in my business course when I teach foreign entry, mostly because, in large part because I grew up Catholic. On a personal level, I'm a bit skeptic, and although I don't tell my student this, when I use the model, I think the model, the IJM, is not the problem. I think what I'm skeptical about is multinational corporation and social enterprise, in the sense that when you talk about win-win situation, there's always going to be those who wins more than others. And within that win-win situation, it's still based on neo-economic perspective where inequality still can happen. And so I guess, it's more of a comment. I'm not sure what the role is for business or social business in promoting justice. And even social enterprise, for example, they want to be sustainable. I mean, you look at microfinance, most microfinance charge 30% interest rates. And so I'm just a little bit skeptic. I just don't know what the answer is.
No, and you're talking about microfinance, right? So there are two things. So there was and one of the things I use, so many of you are familiar with the work of Muhammad Yunus, right, and the Grameen Bank. And then there was another initiative in Mexico, compartment it was, right? And they were charging interest not 30%, but like close to 120%. And there was this big dialogue between Muhammad Yunus and Michael Chu, who was the CEO of Compartment Imos. And it was like, they were arguing, Michael Chu was arguing that you need to charge these high rates to be competitive because of, all these things. And Yunus was saying that's like, it's almost like the loan sharks. If you're charging that kind of rate, then you're making money from the poor. But to another case in point, there was this microfinance institution in India, SKS Microfinance, started by a person by the name of Vikram Akula. And I in fact cited Vikram Akula in my dissertation because in 2008, he had an interview with the Harvard Business Review. And what they were asking him was, they were saying, you have such a great kind of market in terms of in India, why don't you charge higher rates? And he said, of course the banks who lend to us, they want us to charge higher rates, but we want to keep our loyal customer base. We don't want our clients to be just clients today, but we want them to be clients tomorrow. And so we want them. So that's the reason why we don't want to raise our rate, because we want them to do better so that they can continue to be our clients. Great, right? Really great. Wait, a few years later, all right, Vinod Khosla from here, okay, so they went for an IPO, all right, and their rates, then they started charging high rates, very kind of high-ended repayment tactics, and they were implicated in, I don't know whether you were familiar with those farmer suicides that were taking place in India a couple of years ago. Well, SKS Microfinance was one of the organizations that was implicated in those farmer suicides of microfinance institutions charging high rates. And then, of course, Vikram Akula has left that organization. But, just again, a case in point, yeah, it's kind of there. But in some of these cases, it doesn't work. And you brought the point of conscientious capitalism, right? So there's also conscious capitalism, and a lot of these other movements that are trying to even reform, capitalism from just kind of this cutthroat kind of that we need to get the most money as much. But I made the distinction between ambition and greed, right? Which I think is important because it's the short-term things that get us into trouble. So take United's case, right? Just the recent one. I mean, the amount of share loss in terms of share price, the loss that they got, but that was because of their corporate culture, that that promoted this kind of short-term profit maximization. Even Volkswagen, right, the emission scandal, that kind of because they just wanted to push for their market share. So, but yeah, so I do think looking at some of the examples that there's there are good examples of companies that try to, and they do well in the long term.
There's one back there.
So, thank you very much for an insightful talk. I was appreciative of your digging into the Catholic tradition and social teaching for a backup for your business model that you're proposing. And wondering, in a religiously plural world in which we are operating, what insights from other faith traditions and their ideas of ethical business might we tap into? I'm thinking, for example, about the whole question of La Riba banking, La Riba financial systems that are proposed as kind of an alternative model to cutthroat capitalism that you are talking about from the Islamic point of view.
Well, that's another. I've not really studied the Islamic banking model, but it's kind of they are more kind of unlike speculative financial systems in the Western capitalist system. The Islamic ones are more asset based. So that's a different model. But that's right. I mean, there's a lot to learn. There's an article on my bookshelf to read, which is talking about karmic capitalism. So another form of maybe that's more aligned with conscientious capitalism, bring an Eastern perspective to capitalism. But yeah. So and one of the things I mentioned the special issue of the Journal of Business Ethics and on social entrepreneurship and business ethics. One of the articles was raising the question about, is it right for us to kind of dump the Western capitalistic model on social entrepreneurs in developing countries? I mean, that's an important question to think about as well, because when we think of business and we think of capitalism, we're thinking of largely a Western model. Are there other models? But that's a great question, and I think I'm sure there are possibilities for exploring, and I think we should explore other models.
Okay, hi, Nikki, good to see you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Two of my favorite professors, I have to say that. So thank you. Nikki, I have a question, and I think one of the concern I have, and I think you mentioned, is social ethical. I think that needs to be addressed because I think there's a lot of impact investment of this, impact investment of that. And so sometimes I'm feeling like, are we capitalizing on the impoverishment of other people? Because poverty is a business. And so if it is that, and you take it as what it is, then who's benefiting, and then how can we reap that benefit if it can help the community? I think that has not been studied. I haven't seen anything to help me think that actually it is either ethical or unethical. I'm not making a judgment, but I really believe it is unchecked and it should be checked. So the second point I want to make, we are here in Silicon Valley, so we do have our regional issue. We have 18% of the population who cannot make ends meet, so I have to advocate for my community. And I do hope that some of your thinking can be actually adapted through these corporate social responsibilities. I mean, each of these corporations, they do have a department, CSR. Some is just for name, and some of them, they actually have it integrated into their strategic plan. And those who actually have it in the CSR as integrated part of their strategy do very well in terms of giving, and they're very strategic on how they give. And then the last part that I don't think we have talked about, but I wanted to ask about the implication of the 65 million refugees around the world, because we're talking about people who are impoverished in some areas, and some of them, about 10 million of them, are stateless. How does that implicate all the different things that we're talking about in terms of reducing poverty and even creating a market system for the community, and mainly for the poor? Sorry, too long.
Lots of good questions. But for those of you who don't know, that's Almaz Nagash, who's the executive director of Step Up. And Almaz, you came a little late, but I actually did. I did give and my mother's there as well. So I did mention the situation of poverty in Silicon Valley. And actually, I want to turn the question on to you, because one of the things that Almaz has done is made a lot of the companies aware of the situation of poverty in Silicon Valley. Okay, so with the poverty simulations, etc. Almaz, do you see kind of like that this has brought about some change in the behavior of either executives or company employees in addressing some of these issues?
Yes, but I just got an email. We were so excited about doing, without mentioning the name, a very well-known Silicon Valley, I shouldn't say foundation, whatever, but they do pretty much have a hefty number of very wealthy individuals who wanted to participate and do poverty simulation with Step Up. They've decided not to do it just because they felt like it might not be appropriate for their, I guess, members. My question is, what is not appropriate? So I think in some ways the poverty simulation is very intimidating, because you're actually having people to experience what it feels like to live at $2,400 per month for a family of 4. And that's what poverty looks like in the Valley. But I also have to say, on the other hand, Step Up is funded by 2 corporations right now, Applied Materials and Cisco. And so they really do understand, and I think it does make a difference. I'm always looking for more, and what my role is. Instead of asking them what to do, it's mainly what can we do to help them really understand what's going on. In that sense, I think we have made some stride, but I can't say we've made deep enough to make a big dent in the challenge that we have.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hello, my name is Orlando. I'm a student at the law school here, and I had you as a professor in economics as an undergrad.
Was he tough?
So I actually participated in the poverty simulation here a few days ago, so that was very eye-opening. Yeah, it's super tough to survive on that kind of budget. And you're placed in someone else's shoes and trying to survive, and it's absolutely just mind-blowing. I don't know how people do it. So thank you for doing things like that. It does have an impact, at least for future generations. So my thing was addressing the competition. I feel like the market is large enough that competition, I mean, it's definitely something to think about, but we're talking about huge populations here, so the competition isn't going to be so great when the market share is like, billions of people. And so you're trying to serve a huge population. The competition might not really come into play. Also, larger corporations may adopt and even buy out a social enterprise that is successful. So that kind of goes along with cooperation. But my actual question was, as far as thinking long-term, what do you see as far as available capital if someone wants to start a social business enterprise, get started in something like that? I know investors are going to want their ROI, they want their return on investment. And if you're thinking long term, that's not always a possibility right away. So what are you seeing as far as people that are willing and able to kind of invest in a company? What kind of capital is available for something like that?
That's a great question. And actually, the truth is that there's a whole, group of investors who want to invest in the social impact and not interested so much in the financial return. So we have, this whole field of impacting investing has just kind of, it's grown leaps and bounds in terms of, all of us, even at universities, are thinking about how do we get on board impact investing. So there's a whole segment of investors, and they have this big SOCAP conference every year in San Francisco that brings together a lot of social impact investors. But they're not. But that's where the impact measurement comes into play, and that was something that Almaz was kind of hinting at. Was like, with this full focus on impact investment and impact measurement, kind of like, sometimes it can become challenging. And just to kind of like, so Harvard professor Michael Sandel has this great book, and, if you've not read it, I kind of recommend that you read it. It's called What Money Can't Buy. And it's really this whole challenge that we face with even trying to look at entrepreneurial solutions to the issue of poverty, because whilst you're addressing the issue of fairness, there can be the problem of corruption of something. Okay, so for example, you're coming up with a business model for your enterprise, and you're saying, well, instead of people volunteering, let's pay them, right? And then it corrupts the whole idea of someone volunteering for, in an organization, because that's what gives them fulfillment and joy. And now you say we're going to pay you for it. So that's that's the other side in terms of as impact investing is growing, there's more and more demand for tools for impact measurement. And again, what do you measure, and how do you measure, and how do you do it ethically? I think that's important.
Please join me in thanking Nikki Santos and Bill Sundstrom for today's lecture and dialogue. Thank you both very much. A few announcements that we have. You received an evaluation on the way in. If you could take time to give us some feedback on today's event, we really appreciate your suggestions as we shape future programs. Second announcement is that today's event is the featured public lecture for the Bannon Institute Collaborative on Economic Justice and the Common Good. It is comprised of 6 different faculty that are convening over the course of 2 years and collaborating around their research, teaching, or university initiatives that advance economic justice and the common good. And in about 2 weeks, this collaborative will be hosting a roundtable dialogue on campus, inviting all of us to engage further in these questions, particularly around the question of fairness that Nikki raised here. So we hope that you can join us for that event in about 2 weeks from now. Lunch will be served, and there's more information on our Ignatian Center website. And the third announcement is that we also just invite you to check out a new initiative from the Bannon Institute, our podcast. It's called Integral, and we're in our 2nd season, featuring contributions from each of these 6 members from this collaborative, with these 20-minute segments around their research and the way that engages these questions of the common good and economic justice. So check that out too on the Ignatian Center website or wherever you get your podcasts. So for now, thank you very much all for coming and participating today, and please join me in thanking our contributors once more.
Let's also give the Bannon Institute and Teresa a round of applause.